Hi, I'm Mickey Snowden, 2020 graduate of UNCA's Masters of Liberal Arts and Sciences program and former communications liaison for the Collider, a nonprofit advancing climate change solutions. Investigating climate injustice is my passion and was the focus of my graduate thesis. This short presentation is an overview of the disproportionate impacts of climate change on marginalized peoples in the Southeastern US. The Southeast as a whole is a socially diverse region. Approximately 55% of the U.S. African American population lives in the Southeast, and roughly 20% of these residents live below the poverty line. These socioeconomic factors contribute to a population's social vulnerability, a concept popularized by researcher and professor Susan L. Cutter in the 1990s. Cutter defines social vulnerability as, quote, a measure of both the sensitivity of a population to natural hazards and its ability to respond to and recover from the impacts of hazards, end quote. An individual's ability to adapt to the effects of climate change, also known as one's adaptive capacity, isn't the same for everyone. Adaptive capacity to climate hazards is affected by social determinants of health, such as race, gender, age, income, health status, and education. Climate adaptation plans in the US have traditionally focused on cities and states' physical assets rather than focusing on communities' adaptive capacities. While some adaptation plans have done a good job identifying specific populations most at risk to climate impacts and provided suggestions for how to support these communities, most governments overlook the services they provide for their citizens. Examples of these services include access to affordable housing, homeless shelters, public transportation, food banks, soup kitchens, health clinics, and mental health resources, services that wealthier residents often don't depend on. As climate risks increase, access to these services becomes increasingly important for socially vulnerable populations. Impoverished communities bear the brunt of the effects of climate change, but they may not have the means to do anything about it. These communities often have a difficult time addressing climate change due to their lack of political clout. As I've stated, city-level climate planning has largely left these residents out of important conversations or invited them to be stakeholders in a project only when the group in power deemed it beneficial. Through floodplain buyouts that break up communities and relocate vulnerable populations to other floodplains, rebuilding efforts following major climate hazards that benefit wealthier residents, and green gentrification which displaces low-income and BIPOC households when their neighborhoods become more climate safe and desirable, many cities' climate plans have succeeded in further marginalizing their most vulnerable residents. This isn't only inequitable, but it's dehumanizing. It's privilege in its purest form, both racially and socioeconomically. The wealthy not only keep themselves safe from the worst effects of climate change, but they consider the most impacted and vulnerable communities only at their discretion. Wealthier, educated populations often have the luxury of being protected from the effects of climate change. Bioretention ponds, seawalls, and other adaptive features are often prioritized for neighborhoods in higher tax brackets. Wealthy non-white communities also externalize the causes of climate change to marginalized communities via their elevated waste and emissions rates, which can be attributed to higher energy, food, and material consumption. The factories where products are made, the interstates where they're delivered, the facilities that house and treat human and household waste are disproportionately located in poor, non-white neighborhoods and significantly contribute to climate change. An example of this sort of climate injustice is urban heat disparity. Urban heat islands have been getting significant media attention lately, and for good reason. In 2019, NPR reported that lower income and BIPOC households can be up to 10 degrees hotter than whiter, more affluent neighborhoods located just miles away. This is because poor neighborhoods are more densely packed, have fewer trees and green spaces, have more pavement and concrete per square foot, and house heavy polluters like factories and interstates, which generate higher CO2 emissions. These paved areas and buildings absorb and trap heat, whereas trees and green spaces cool wealthier neighborhoods by sequestering CO2 and repelling heat. Urban heat islands also tend to be located in neighborhoods that were historically redlined, a fact that is particularly true in Asheville. The key takeaway of this presentation is that climate change is and will continue to disproportionately impact socially vulnerable populations. Therefore, climate adaptation planning must prioritize these communities. If adaptation planning continues to favor wealthy communities, the public health and socioeconomic divide will continue to grow along racial lines, costing taxpayers and governments huge amounts of money, not to mention it's unjust and negligent. When socially vulnerable populations are prioritized, adaptation planners must consider the possible side effects of their proposals. For example, building a greenway through a poor neighborhood may cool the area, improve pedestrian access to other parts of the city, and improve quality of life, but it can also increase property taxes and lead to neighborhood gentrification. City planners and state officials should ensure marginalized voices are heard and elevated during public comment periods, and they should have the foresight to protect socially vulnerable neighborhoods from climate change and green gentrification. Climate change is intertwined with economics, racial and gender equality, public health, and virtually all other aspects of society. Addressing climate change within a justice framework will ensure all peoples in this country and beyond are guaranteed a high quality of life. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.